what you frequently hear is that they feel insecure when the relationship is coming to an end. But if someone truly does not care, if someone is so detached from the relationship, why would they have such strong emotions when their partner threatens to leave the relationship? You see what I mean? In other words, they wouldn't care because it's like, do whatever you want. That's the whole, remember, the grandiose sense of self. That's the dismissive attitude. That's the affect block. Those are all the concepts that we were just talking about. They all point to that they don't care. They don't get attached. But then when you hear something like they feel insecure or they become depressed when the relationship ends, it makes you begin to question, maybe they do care. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. I'm excited to bring you some insightful content from a recent interview I participated in. The interview lasted over an hour and a half, covering an extensive range of topics, mostly related to narcissistic traits and relationship dynamics. But since there was so much material covered, I think it's too much just to put into one episode. So over the next few episodes, we will unpack some of the questions that emerged, such as, why do some narcissistic individuals claim to not get jealous, but then they get really upset if their partner ends the relationship? And sometimes they even fall into a depression. And what causes this problematic way of relating? Relating, in other words, as if they don't really care about their partner. But like I said, on the other hand, getting depressed if the partner leaves them. Now, the feedback that I received based on the questions that came up and the way that I responded, the responses were unique because they offered a psychodynamic perspective on narcissism and narcissistic relational dynamics. Insights one does not typically hear in the social media content on this topic. So let's get right into it. And we'll get started by thinking about narcissistic characteristics and relationship dynamics. The first question that came up was about trust and jealousy in relationships. When listening closely to interviews, this woman who was interviewing me has listened to many interviews with people who suffer with narcissistic characteristics or NPD proper, as have I, by the way. But what's commonly heard is that what you hear is they don't get jealous, that they're not really upset, for instance, if their partner, goes out to the bar with some friends or is going away on a trip with her girlfriends. Now, the interviewer was quite curious about this because she was assuming that they don't get jealous because they're not really worried about, worried what their partner will do when they're out at the bar, for instance, or they don't really have this feeling as if they are being abandoned. However, it's been reported, again, when listening to the interviews and the way that these people who have these narcissistic characteristics, is that when the same partner declares that she wants to end the relationship, that in fact, it does have quite an effect on them. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction here. And the interviewer was wondering if this implies that he doesn't worry because she couldn't possibly find anyone better than him. If she's out with her girlfriends, for instance. And that's why he doesn't get jealous. Now, in my response to this question, I wanted to make it clear that in my own experience, what I have found is that these individuals actually do care. In other words, sort of the prototypical relationship, the narcissistic relationship, what you hear in social media is one of somebody who's involved in a relationship, but they don't really care about their partner. They're quite dismissive. And you may have heard some of these concepts, like they gaslight, right? They gaslight their partner, they're manipulative, they're detached. But all of this, all of these things that I'm describing, again, in my own experience, all sort of pivot around what's at the core of the narcissistic structure, which is something that we call the grandiose sense of self. That's their own sense of omnipotence. And the grandiose sense of self is supported by a belief that they are independent. In other words, they don't depend on anybody. And if I could borrow from a psychoanalytic concept for a moment, it's because of this, what we call an affect block. It seems as if they don't care. It seems as if they are not jealous when their partner leaves town with her girlfriends, again, for instance. But what is this affect block? You may be wondering. So, an affect block is like a wall that comes up. It's a wall, it's a block that defends against feelings of genuine closeness. So that's the block. The block is against feeling genuinely close to another, to your partner. This defense makes it seem like they don't care. That's why I said before, it's as if they don't care. So this block makes it seem like they don't care. And it's what drives the dismissive attitude that's so characteristic of those with narcissistic traits. And you may often hear stuff like this, and I quote, "I don't care," or whatever. The individual never reaches out. Like, this is another example. This is part of the affect block, that the individual will never reach out to you first, for example, or they have a really hard time letting you know that they're invested in the relationship. In short, it's a block from being affectively invested, that's emotionally invested in the relationship, and letting that be known. Now, just a very quick digression. Another way I can explain this affect block, which may make it a little bit easier for you to understand, is in narcissism, it's commonly associated with, and I quote, the insecure or dismissive attachment style. So if you're familiar with the different attachment styles, oftentimes narcissism is associated with insecure or dismissive. Individuals with this avoidant type of attachment style have this dismissive attitude towards relationships and emotional closeness. They have, or I should say, they value independence and self-sufficiency to an extreme degree. Remember, I don't need anything. It's hard to ask for anything because if you ask for something, then you're expressing a need, right? So this self-sufficiency gets played out to an extreme degree, and that leads to an avoidance of intimacy and vulnerability, right? Because you're not so vulnerable if you don't have any needs, because you don't need anybody. Many people with narcissistic traits exhibit avoidant behaviors. Their grandiosity and sense of superiority, which I'm sure you've heard about in terms of narcissistic characteristics. But what I'm suggesting here is this could be seen as a defense, right? This is like a defense mechanism to keep others at a distance, preventing emotional intimacy, which of course they find to be very threatening. That's why they have to defend against being close and being genuinely intimate with another person. And I'm not talking about sexual intimacy, which is very different. Sexual intimacy brings up a level of intensity, but intensity is different than intimacy. But anyway, I digressed. This style of attachment helps them maintain a sense of control and avoid perceived risk of dependency and therefore of rejection, right? Because if you're never invested, if you never depend on somebody, the risk of being rejected goes what? Way down. In other words, it protects the fragile sense of self that will fall apart if the other person is let in. But why? You may now be asking. Is letting someone in perceived as so intrusive or dangerous? We need to go a bit deeper to answer that question. So let's explore that more closely in a moment, okay? Because I want to just continue with this other line of thought, because there's one more thing that it's important to understand about this affect block, or what we can call a dismissive attachment style. And this will also help all of you who are in a relationship with someone who is constantly diminishing you, right? They don't really hear what you have to say. They don't seem to take what you say very seriously. But I want to emphasize that there's a paradox here. The paradox is, while in a state of non-relatedness, there is an enormous longing for involvement. How do I know that? Let's return to the example I gave just a moment ago of the individual with narcissistic characteristics who does not get jealous or care if his partner is out with, goes out with her girlfriends or travels or goes to the bar, right? In listening closely to these kinds of interviews, what I almost always hear is, this is what usually comes up next. And this is without them realizing it, but they may say something like, I felt insecure when they were planning on leaving me. So in other words, once they start, which is not uncommon, it's hard to maintain a relationship with somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics and is dismissive of you. And sometimes it's only a matter of time before there's some talk about them leaving you. So in this particular interview, or in many of these interviews, I should say, is what you frequently hear is that they feel insecure when the relationship is coming to an end. But if someone truly does not care, if someone is so detached from the relationship, why would they have such strong emotions when their partner threatens to leave the relationship? You see what I mean? In other words, they wouldn't care because it's like, do whatever you want. That's the whole, remember, the grandiose sense of self. That's the dismissive attitude. That's the affect block. Those are all the concepts that we were just talking about. They all point to that they don't care. They don't get attached. But then when you hear something like they feel insecure or they become depressed when the relationship ends, it makes you begin to question, maybe they do care. Also, and I just want to apologize in advance if this seems a bit obsessive, but in my work with these individuals, I find it crucial to always pay attention to the smallest details, sometimes those details that are not discussed in the manifest story. For example, if someone says, I don't get jealous when my partner goes out, I would then inquire about their evening without their partner. What did they do in their free time? What was it like? Where were you? What was your experience? These things are not part of the story. But in answering this question that came up as I was being interviewed about whether a narcissist trusts or they get jealous, in part, I can't answer that question unless I understand what's their experience without the partner. Let's go beyond the manifest story. Did they get high on drugs? In other words, the partner goes out, they're like, I don't care, but then they go get high, or they overdrink, or they fall into a vegetative state, or they don't feed themselves, right? They miss dinner because they're sitting on the couch watching TV, or they turn to some other compulsive behaviors like pornography, or you could fill in the blank here. But all of these behaviors are ways to avoid dealing with the feelings that are associated with separation and loss. That's what happens when the partner leaves. There's a separation. Interestingly, in listening closely to interviews, this is what I was mentioning earlier, that I listened to these interviews with individuals with narcissistic personality traits after discussing experiences of loss, like my partner went out with her friends, they again if you listen closely, they talk about falling into a depression. Now, they don't connect this depression with the loss because, in their mind, they need to uphold the illusion that they don't need anyone. So if they're lying in bed all day in a vegetative state, they may not necessarily connect that with the fact that their girlfriend went away for the weekend with her friends. This dismissive attitude, this affective block, prevents them from acknowledging the true impact of the separation. How is it, and why do these individuals go from feeling really good to presenting as completely depressed? See, in other words, how do they go from being in this relationship so excited, everything is wonderful and blissful, everything is fine, and then they go away, right? The partner leaves for the weekend with her girlfriends, and they're completely depressed. How is that? So, why do some individuals with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, fall apart and fall into a depression? To answer that question, I need to provide you with just a little bit of theory to help you more deeply appreciate the profound impact loss has on these individuals. Healthy caregiver love is crucial in early development. See, we're going way back, all right? But just bear with me for a moment and I'll pull this all together. Healthy caregiver love allows the self to develop. This is the developing sense of self that gets internalized, right? So there's an internalized expectation of being loved for who you are, right? Loved for who you are rather than for a performance. Well, let me just give a simple example of this, okay? So this way you can understand what I mean. Let's say you clean your room and proudly present this to your parent. Over time, if consistent, your parent's response is going to impact how you feel about yourself. So if they express that they are impressed with the work you did, this is what we call the gleam in the eye, right? That means they look at you and they feel proud, or they give you a look like, you should feel proud of what you did. This illustrates this gleam in the eye, like, I see you and I see what you did. And this is a good feeling. And this good feeling, if repeated and consistent, is what gets taken into oneself, right? This is in my field, again, the field of psychoanalysis, what we call internalization. You carry this around now inside of you. Now, there are different ways to express the caregiver's reaction. But in short, this foundational experience includes affective attunement, where the caregiver is in sync with the child's emotional state. It includes, in other words, the caregiver's response includes emotional resonance. Again, these are just concepts that we put on this reaction, okay? I'm just labeling the reaction. So there's affective attunement, they're in sync, there's emotional resonance where the child feels understood and mirrored, and there's containment where the caregiver helps manage, label, and soothe the child's emotional experiences. Like in this case, this is a good experience. In other cases, the child may be overwhelmed, feeling anxious. If that is properly contained, right, with emotional resonance and affective attunement, I mean, you can picture this, right? All of this is what begins to get internalized. And if I just want to oversimplify this, can you picture this? It's like if you clean your room or you do something and you're feeling proud and you see the gleam in the eye or the smiling caregiver, it's like you internalize a smile, which over time becomes the self, yourself, because it gets taken into you, smiling at yourself. It's about developing a capacity. If you can smile at yourself and carry that around, it's like a capacity to soothe oneself at times of loss and separation, which, by the way, is what we're talking about in this example. So in times of separation, and this doesn't happen literally. So it's not like you could just fake this and say, oh, I'm going to smile at myself like some kind of self-help book. It doesn't work that way. What I'm talking about is a slow, long process of internalizing a good feeling that you could pull on in times of loss. What's loss? The partner goes away with her friends, or not being immediately available. Someone's not available to you. They're not responding quickly enough to a text message, or perhaps your partner's feeling tired and on a particular evening is not interested in intimacy. All of these are sort of the losses of everyday life that need to be managed. This inner smile, and I quote, smiling image undoes the feeling of loss implicit in the separation experience. And then they do not have to, or they don't collapse or fall into that depressed state. Remember, we digressed here for a moment, and I was giving you just a little bit of like a foundational history, because we were thinking about how someone can go from not caring to becoming completely depressed and maybe spending the weekend on the couch. Okay, let's return to the example of the boy showing his parent that he cleaned his room. What if he proudly presents his room and his parent shows very little interest, does not ask questions, or is critical that he didn't do a good enough job? What if they begin to point out all of what he missed while paying no attention to what he accomplished? This is what then gets taken into oneself. I am not enough. What I do is not of value. And because this is such an early stage of development, this gets confused with, I'm not of value, right? Especially if this is repetitive and there's more of this than the gleam in the eye, one begins to feel that I am not of value, that there's a sense of worthlessness. And this, by the way, is a very common underlying feeling amongst those with NPD, a feeling of worthlessness. Okay, so that begins, I hope, to answer why they are prone to such devastating feelings of depression, and they collapse around these separations, this loss, and they put up this affective dismissive block in order to not get invested. But you may be asking, what causes them to take on this defensive position in the relationship? Why the need for the affective block and this dismissive attitude? Why do they need to create a distance from their partner? This is a complicated question with many different ways to conceptualize a response, but in part, think about caregivers who are over-involved or overindulgent of the child. Can you imagine how this can negatively impact a child's emotional development? Now, you may be saying overindulgence, they're always there for the child. Their whole life revolves around the child. They sacrifice a lot, that's the caregiver, for the child. Aren't these all really good, helpful qualities or things that the child can then internalize? But what I would say to that is the overindulgent caregiver is not truly there for the child. No. On the surface, it appears that they are invested and have the child's best interest in mind, which of course to some extent is true. However, closer examination typically reveals that they have an incredibly hard time letting the child separate and develop a mind of their own. They have an incredibly hard time letting the child make mistakes and learn from mistakes, or feel frustrated and learn to tolerate frustration. And by the way, this is what increases frustration tolerance and impulse control. In other words, the caregiver creates a relationship where you are not seen as a separate person, but rather as someone at the disposal of the caregiver. And what I mean by that is, if they cannot allow the child to have moments of frustration, that is more for the caregiver than it is for the child. See, in other words, then the child is there for the caregiver, if that makes sense. because it's not in a child's best interest, because some level of delaying gratification and being frustrated or being in conflict about something is healthy and important. It pushes forward development. So this is not for the child. So what I'm saying now is that the child is there to take care of an emotional need of the parent. So the child is someone who's like controlled in a way. This dynamic is often seen with caregivers who need you to be centered on them, to do what they like, engage in their activities of interest, always be by their side, follow their diet, have the body type that they think is desirable. See, in other words, all these little subtle things all lead up to that you are always there for them, that you can never desert them, meaning you are expected to offer your full attention or admiration, to be by their side, as I mentioned before. And when you don't do this, then they give you a hard time. They put pressure on you. That's what I meant earlier when I said you're controlled. So a child growing up with a parent like this, who's overly invested, ends up feeling like, this goes back to what I said earlier, that they need to perform, right? They end up feeling controlled, dominated, and in order to survive this kind of relationship and not lose the love, there's the separation again, by the way. They don't want to lose the love of the parent, who will get incredibly upset if the developing child begins to put on some extra weight or eats snacks or plays on his, the video games, or is on the phone too much. All of these are things that the parent has a hard time controlling within themselves. They have their own feelings about this, but rather than managing their own feelings, they try to manage the child, if that makes sense. Okay, so why did I digress into this specific type of parenting? We were trying to answer the question of the affect block or the avoidant and dismissive attachment style. We could see if one grows up with a parent or a caregiver who's overly invested in this way, which could be quite intrusive, by maintaining an emotional distance, by creating an illusion of self-sufficiency. Like, I don't need this parent. They protect themselves from the potential pain of, one, being let down if they disappoint the parent and the parent rejects them, the parent criticizes them, the parent withdraws, right? When they don't do what the parent wants them to do. So they protect themselves from all of those feelings. And I mentioned earlier, they protect themselves from being controlled by others. So the affective block, the dismissive, avoidant attachment style, is compensatory in nature. It protects them. This dismissive stance helps them preserve a sense of autonomy and control. But as you can imagine, it often comes at the cost of deeper, more meaningful relationships, which we have to talk about much more, but not today, because we have to wrap this up. But I will just say one more quick thing, just in the service of review. Review is always helpful, and then we'll push forward in the next episode. Individuals with narcissistic traits often develop a dismissive attachment style, what we call the affect block, as a defense, right? To protect themselves, to protect their fragile sense of self. This stems from early experiences with caregivers who were over-involved, controlling, and conditional in their affection, leading to a deep-seated fear of dependency and rejection. By maintaining emotional distance and self-sufficiency, or I should say, seemingly self-sufficient. Remember, that's what I was getting at the very beginning of this episode, right? That's the paradox. They present as if they need nothing, but they are longing for a deeper connection. However, they cannot sustain a meaningful connection because they're terrified that they'll be controlled and taken over as they were in their formative years. While this dismissive attitude preserves their autonomy, it also hinders the formation of deeper, more meaningful relationships, leaving them feeling quite isolated and prone to feelings of worthlessness, and that's the depression that I went into earlier. Then they collapse when that other person isn't there, when they're faced with loss or separation. All right, in the next episode, we're going to cover another type of narcissistic relationship where each partner is in a collusion. There's a secret agreement between them that can sustain what seemingly looks like a healthy relationship until it suddenly collapses. If you want to learn more about this secret agreement and how everything can quickly turn bad, sometimes referred to in the technical term as splitting, please consider subscribing to the Narcissism Decoder podcast so you don't miss part 2 of this series on narcissistic relationships. Okay, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.